lot of time practicing how to say my name right. And this is the first time in 18 years that he's gotten it right, so it's really good. I also want to mention that feedback is very important, because if you give us bad feedback, we don't get invited to do this again. So, so my focus is really I'm not going to use many slides, so this is really more an oral presentation. I decided not to use PowerPoint, so you're going to have to look at me. I've got just tables up there rather than put the whole text. That's okay, I just turned it off. The big question that I really wanted to address today, and it's a driving point, one of the main points behind my book that I've been working on forever and ever, is really the relationship between technology transfer, is that what it says? Yeah, technology transfer and returnees. And the general literature and a lot of the research would say that people come back, and then the society that gets these people to come back often gets the benefit of the technology transfer, right? But what I try and argue is that, in fact, it's the tech transfer and the opportunities for tech transfer that is actually driving migration. So if you think of this in terms of dependent and independent variables, sort of what's explaining what, right? A lot of the literature will say, oh yeah, people are coming back and they bring technology, and that's a great benefit for the country, right? So, I mean, people have been writing about that for a long time. A lot of very good analysts who write about reverse migration make that point. But what I, particularly in a survey that I did in 2004, what I found, in fact, was that a significant number of people who returned from China, entrepreneurs who we interviewed, they actually said that the reason that they came back to China was because they had technology. That it wasn't that they were coming back and brought the technology, but it was, in fact, the opportunities generated for them, largely in the domestic economy in China, that made them decide to come back to China. Part of the theoretical underpinning of this is in the migration literature, there's a concept called the new economics of migration. And that argument argues that migration is a two-step process, not a one-step process. And that the whole concept of reverse migration, which is what we're looking at, the whole concept of reverse migration is very strategic. It's not something that, oh, I'm going to go over to the US and, oh, you know, hey, this is interesting, but maybe I'll go back to China. But the argument that the people who led this school argue is that people go out in a very strategic way. They argue that largely someone from a family, you know, it's a family strategy, but we can think of it as an individual strategy. The second point that I would make is that the way also to think about this technology and this that they're bringing back is to think of it in terms of what I call a shortage good. Something that's short, missing in the domestic economy. Because it's what's missing in the domestic economy that they bring back that gives them comparative advantage in the domestic market. So they bring back something that I mean, I didn't invent the term shortage. I can tell you that, I heard this term, first of all, in about 2004, when I was doing interviews in Changchun at the Yingyong Hua Xue Yuan, right? Now everyone's going to go, oh, 他的中文那么好，怎么可能, right? Okay, 我70年到76年在北京留学, so I lived in Beijing from 74 to 76, so that's when I actually learned my Chinese. And the Li Yuan Chao wrote a report, it was 签字给他一个报告, right? So in Chinese, but his English is pretty good. Anyway, so this idea of shortage came out during my interview with a guy in the Institute of Applied Chemistry under Chinese Academy of Sciences in Changchun, and he laid out for me what was his strategy. He said, I went out to Japan, I got a PhD. He said, when I went out, I looked around for a field, a specialization that was what he called, and nobody really, most Chinese don't understand this, or they don't see that he called it a tremen, a shortage field, men as in gate, or that someone's shaking their head, and so maybe it makes sense. He certainly said it. A tremen, a shortage good, or a shortage field. And as China's been catching up since the late 70s, early 80s, a lot of it has been going out and learning stuff and bringing this stuff back. But this was a very strategic plan, to go out, get a PhD in Japan, and basically write his dissertation about something that was in short supply. I thought, this is like an epiphany, we say in English. Wow, right? So then I decided to pursue this, and as I interviewed more people in Beijing, I discovered that you didn't have to get a PhD to do this. One guy said I went out for a postdoc, and I went to Columbia. And the first year I spent in Columbia, I looked around the US and I looked around to see what was here in technology that we didn't have in China. The second year, he said, 我掌握了. I got control of it. I got a handle on it, as we like to say, right? Something's going on here and I'm pushing buttons. So 我掌握了, right? So much for technology at the University of Science and Technology. So he said 我掌握了, I learned this technology. And then the next year he came back looking for a job, and in fact, sorry, I always screw up. Here, try this. And in fact, what he did was he got a job at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which leads me to the point that the government, the state in China, is an active player in this process. Now, it's not a huge player in terms of when you do surveys of people and you say to them, what were the main reasons you came back? Was the 右惠政策, were the preferential policies of the state, were they very, very important to you, or how important were they? You only get usually 10%, 15% will say, yeah, it was important, 20% max. Right, but the shortage, the idea of the shortage economy, I mean, the state has played an important role in it, and so in fact, policy documents and reports, even back in 1999, I have a document from Shanghai that talks about persons who have patents and inventions or technology leading in the world, or filling gaps in the projects urgently needed at home, right? And people who have obtained a PhD degree in urgently needed professional fields. So the state understands this, right? It knows what it needs to do very clearly. We know, Li Yuanchao, the 1,000 Talents program, has talked about this as well. So there's a very clear strategy. And when you look at what CAST did, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, they would interview people for a position, and basically they wanted to hear a report about what did you have? Do you have something new? Are you bringing something back? And if you have something back, they would give you 2 million yuan, right? They'd give you a laboratory. They'd give you research assistants. They'd probably give you a 读博士, a local PhD to work for you as your research assistant, who would hate you because he was a 读博士and you were a young 博士. You were a foreign PhD and you got the big job and he was working for you. I've interviewed people to discover that as well. But that's really, a driving force, right? So let me show you the data, right, just to support this argument. So here's level of technology by migration status, 2004. And here you can see that people came back, a significant number of people came back with technology, right? And the largest number said that they came back with not new international technology, but new for China, which means that it's the domestic market that's their advantage, right? That they're thinking that. They can't get necessarily world-class technology. Maybe they were part of a team and they don't have the copyright or the IPR right. They don't want to steal it. So they bring back something that's useful to use in China, right? And here, of the 50 people who said that they returned either for technology being the first, let me say, so 28 out of 100 returnees in the survey in 2004 said that the main reason that they came back to China was because of technology. The main reason. So 28% of the people supported this hypothesis, right? That they came back for technology. Another 27%, or 27 out of 100 people, said it was the second most important reason. So then we could put together, that's 55 people, but I only had, I think for some reason it doesn't work, I wind up with 50, and so you can see that among those people, the 50 who came back for technology, either being the first or the second reason, 62% of them said that it was technology that was only new for China. It wasn't necessarily technology that was globally, right? Globally, it was 32%. So this again says, you know, supports the argument that these people are really thinking that domestic technology, or you know, the domestic market too, is very important. And we know that a lot of people return, or Taiwanese have gone into China. We know that the domestic market's a big deal. How am I doing time-wise? Great, thank you. My singing teacher is here, so I have to hold myself back. Derek Anthony, if anyone wants singing lessons, if anybody wants singing lessons in opera, just ask Derek, but I won't sing today. So, we did a regression of the returnees and the locals in the 200 cases that we had, and we had asked them, I did this with Wilfried von Honecker, who used to be at UST, and we asked people a subjective measure of success. How successful is your firm relative to other firms in your industry? Because they're not going to tell you how much money they make. They're not going to give you that kind of information. So the best thing we could do would be to ask them how they saw their firm doing relative to others. And so that was our dependent variable, whether they were successful or not, and what explained that success. And so here, for those of you, you know, if it's a 0.05 or better, or a 0.09, we're sort of cutting at it, right? But if it's clearly 0.05 or better, then it's very significant, it's important. 0.09, you can push it a little bit, people cheat a little bit, right? But here you can see that the level of technology, and don't worry about the negative, that the level of technology is a very significant explanation for their business success. So clearly these entrepreneurs, their technology is very important. And we know that of these people, more than half of them, right, are bringing back technology that's not world-class. It's just new for China, and that's giving them this kind of comparative advantage. Okay, so that's where we stood, and I actually gave this presentation at UST about 6 months ago. Then, about a friend of mine, Wang Huiyao, Henry Wang, Henry Wang, some people may know who he is. He continues to do surveys. He does the blue books on talent, the Rencai, Guoji Rencai, Lanpi Shu, right? He does these books. They're published. If you're interested in the topic, they're great. They're published predominantly. They're published in Chinese, but they're really good. Though we had a more scientific sample than he does, which would be my one comment, I would say. So here's his 2001 survey, and you can see that the people who have already returned, 124 people that he surveyed, 60% of them, almost, were now bringing back world-class technology, and only 23% were bringing back new for the domestic market. So the question for me was, is there a change, right? And is it that, in fact, people in 2004 were still filling in the landscape, right? These openings in the domestic economy that this technology needs, and now as those things got filled up, you needed to bring back more world-class technology to be competitive. And in the survey he did in 2001 too, and in some discussions I had, it seemed that there had been a change. Though I haven't been able to go back. I'd like to do another much more scientific survey as we did in 2004 to really check if this is true. But let's take it for being true. So what I did was then, having gotten this data, I then approached the Institute for Emerging Market Studies at HKUST, which is funded by Ernst & Young. And I wrote a proposal saying, if this is happening in China, that we see in 2004, and then there's a shift by 2011, 2012, is this a generalizable trend? That societies, emerging markets that just start to emerge, or as they start to get more globally involved, that this is the pattern that happens, and then eventually do they then have to upgrade their technology? So I thought, let's look at another emerging market. So I decided to go to India. Now I will preface my comments by saying I know nothing about India, right? People used to go to China when I've been going to China since, as I said, it's 40 years, and we always used to joke about those people who went to China for a week wrote a book, right? My China experience, the real China, right? And then those people who went for a month would write an article, right? And then those of us who spent a lot of time there never wrote because we knew that the place was so complicated. Anyway, so setting all that aside, right, I decided to be foolish and go to India. And the driving question really was, is India should be in the stage where, if my China hypothesis is correct, maybe India is in the stage where you bring back domestic or technology that's new for the domestic economy and not global, and that over time we'll see some kind of transition. Okay, so that was my hypothesis. So in fact, I did 24 interviews in 2 weeks. Whew. Right, that's a lot. 20 of them were returnees, 4 were locals. I didn't do enough locals, but I wanted to get a sense of the returnees. 18 of them had set up their own companies, and 2 of them were working for multinational corporations. So the question was, what kind of technology are they bringing back? Are they looking at the domestic market, or are they looking at international markets? And I also very interested in their views about corruption and their views of the role of the state, because that's clearly something that I know a fair amount about for return business entrepreneurs in China, though Professor Lee doesn't say it, but he also knows an awful lot about returned entrepreneurs and does a lot of writing about that. So what did I find? Well, first, counterintuitive, or sort of against my general view, 11 out of 14 respondents that I was able to ask them and remember to ask them and sort of get the data that it would fit. 11 of 14 in India said that their technology is internationally the latest technology. So my hypothesis right off the bat, right, which is good. Social science is about that, because then you want to try and explain why, right? And that becomes much more interesting in some ways and more exploratory, or it's just a way to cover your butt when your hypothesis doesn't work. You then decide that you better try, be smart and find out something else. In fact, most people in India that I interviewed, and much more so than in China, say they went back home for family. Their parents are old, they feel family ties, and the reason also is that the people that I'm interviewing in India were reasonably successful in Silicon Valley. We're doing okay. Wharton graduates, I got stuck in a Wharton network, because this is all snowball sampling, right? It's not random sample. It's I know somebody introduced me somebody else. I mean, that's the way you can do it. So a lot of these people were relatively successful, and they were, I think, much older and much more experienced than the Chinese returnees, right? The Chinese returnees were often young people who just graduated from college, maybe at a postdoc, had an idea about a technology and decided to come back to China. These guys, on average, probably, some had come back right after college, but on average, I would say 10 years working, right? So these were much more sophisticated. These people had already been through 1 or 2 technologies. These people had worked for multinational corporations in Silicon Valley, and so they came back, and they were doing okay in the States. So a lot of them would say, I was doing fine there, but I came back. My parents are getting older. I want my kids to speak Hindi, right? I value Indian culture, just much more so than I normally get when I do the interviews in China. That's a secondary reason for, I mean, as we get older, our parents get older, so for some people it's very important. It's also a reason people like to come to HKUST, because then their parents can come down for 3 months and take care of the grandchildren. The other thing is that these people didn't see the domestic sector as being such a driving force for them, but still pretty important. One of the reasons is that I think a lot of them have what we would call inappropriate technology. They're too advanced. The Indian economy, 5 minutes, but you hold it upside down. So, yeah, okay, well, I'm fine. I got great quotes. Indian companies don't have the stomach for any good ideas, right? So I don't have data. I don't have big data numbers, which is not good enough. Local market needs this technology, but domestic firms won't pay. Really high tech will never get yields in Indian market, right? But yet, in fact, most of them were selling in the domestic market. But if you ask them, they would say, within 5 years, I want to be exporting. Okay, so that's a big thing. Some said they were testing their technology in the domestic market before going overseas because, quote, the domestic market is much more forgiving than the international market. These people knew if they went overseas, tried to compete internationally with these new techs, because these guys are all devising new technologies, most of them, or some of them, a significant number. Now, the thing, so I made that point. Okay. Now their market, as I said, their market was largely domestic, but they had aspirations to go international. And so I went back and checked. And in technology, in the technology sector, India makes about $100 billion a year in technology, of which 2/3 is export, 1/3 is domestic. I would have thought it'd be more export. That was my assumption. So the export sector really drives a lot of the technology stuff. And part of this is that people can go back to India with the technology or develop the technology in India because, as Thomas Friedman said, the world is flat, right? So you can do that technology study anywhere because there's no barriers. If somebody invents something in Silicon Valley, you know the application in a week, right, on the web. This stuff moves really fast. These people watch this technology flying really fast. So what they can do in India is they can hire really smart kids who have just graduated from IIT, from the Indian Institute of Technology. These are really smart kids, right? And they can work for them. 5, 6, 7, 10 of them, and that's all they need to create some new kind of technology. So these are great opportunities for these people back in India to do these kind of startups. Now, McKinsey will say that the Indian domestic economy needs this technology. I looked online and looked at a McKinsey report, and McKinsey says Indians need this technology, but they don't want to pay for it, which we used to hear about China as well. Also, the manufacturing, I mean, if you're going to do technology and you want to sell domestically, to a certain extent, you have to be helping manufacturing firms improve their efficiency, which is what the Indians need. But of the GDP, the domestic industry is only 16% of Indian GDP, where it's 33% of Chinese GDP. So there's a much smaller domestic industrial sector in India for these people then to develop these technologies and work domestically. In terms of the role of the state, was that 5 minutes on 20 minutes or 5 on 25? 3 minutes for 20 minutes or 25 minutes? In total 25. Okay, so I'm running out of time. So let me just say a word about the role of the state. Most Indians hate the state, right? Quotes like, I'm doing business in spite of the state, right? The attitude of people towards the state in China and towards India is very different. Returnees in general who set up companies don't like the state either, but they know they need it and they're willing to work with it. And in my view, Chinese corruption, state corruption, is about 20% of the business. They'll take about 20% of your profit, but they'll facilitate your business. So we have what you would call market facilitating corruption in China, whereas in India, you have predatory corruption, where everybody will say they'll take 80%. You see all kinds of projects begun in India, never stopped, never finished. And these people that I interviewed, by and large, tried to stay far away from the state. It reminded me of a joke, I'm sorry, I have to tell it. In Fiddler on the Roof, this guy goes up to the rabbi and he says, "Rabbi, Rabbi, is there a blessing for the czar?" And the rabbi says, "Of course there's a blessing for the czar. May God bless and keep the czar far away from us." Right? So the general attitude in India is stay away from the state unless there's a real reason. You pay your taxes, but you don't engage with the state in the way that you do in China. Bureaucracy is massive, corruption is incomparable, right? Quotes like that. Do you work with the state? Did you get any help from the state? Not a farthing. Notice the British, not a farthing, right? I don't expect that they would be only a hindrance, right? Okay, so let me, the locals, though, my hypothesis would also be locals are more comfortable with the state, more willing to pay bribes, and to a certain extent, that's true. They're more willing to work with the state, and that's also true for Chinese local entrepreneurs versus returned entrepreneurs. And it's statistically significant in my 2004 survey that local entrepreneurs are much more comfortable paying state and living with a little bit of corruption than the returnees. Conclusion. So, yeah, 1 minute. Well, it's conclusion, that's all it takes, right? So first of all, I would say the big question, sort of this whole question of reverse migration, technology transfer, talent flow, and all that, it's actually quite interesting that, you know, this is what my friend Henry Wang likes to call the third wave of globalization. We had capital, what did we have? We had capital, we had goods, and now we're having people. And China has done remarkably well on this. Not as well as it could, and the 1,000 Talents program, which we can answer and we can talk about in Q&A, has some limits to its success, which is what I told Li Yuanchao. But still, overall, if you look at this, there's some decent technology coming back to China. A lot of people flowing back, going into these institutions, into these institutes. Now, we see this also in India, but it just isn't happening in the same way. First of all, it's not driving the domestic economy. These people are still thinking more in terms of international linkages. When you talk to Indians, you hear much more that they talk about the international linkages back to Silicon Valley, back overseas. Whereas when you talk to domestic China, when you talk to Chinese, it's not so much. You talk about your Wangluo, your network, but they won't talk as much about their technological ties back overseas. I think I can stop there. Let me stop there. Time's up. Okay.